do you think the end result of the interviews is a knockout? I think the first 3 sessions they filmed was all Nixon, and I think a prize fight is definitely a good analogy because it's kind of like the champ up there, like RopeADope. Like he'd let the opponent, you know, tire out, and then he'd just go in for the knockout. I think if like Nixon had held his own in the last interview, then Nixon would have definitely won. But Faust definitely knocked him out in that last round. It's a knockout.
Yeah. Okay, I agree a lot with what Clark says. I thought it was a lot like a prize fight. Nixon is able to land the first few blows. Kind of, he does it very, very subtly. Like he says, like they do fornicate last night, different stuff like that, just making Faust really uncomfortable. And I think Nixon actually had the opportunity to win, but he decided to be completely honest by then. So I don't think he got knocked out per se. Like at the very end, he decided to let Faust throwing punches, and then he admitted to everything he did, and he actually apologized and he fessed up because he was tired of not fessing up.
I think in some ways, he sort of bettered his position from letting Faust, get him a little bit, because it shows sort of a humility and like lowers him down to be like, someone you can empathize with a little bit more, rather than someone that's just like always refusing everything. It makes him more human.
I think that like everyone eventually cracks. So like you keep getting hit and getting hit, then you're eventually gonna crack and fess up. It only takes so much. Oh, sure, when you die.
Yeah, that's me. Okay, sweet, thanks. Okay, so I think Nixon also, won not only in the interviews, but kind of what the interviews were doing to them, because Nixon got like really confident, and it said somewhere in one of the stage directions that he came back the next day for the next interview like looking younger and like more like ready to go, and Faust was looking more tired and stressed and was kind of freaking out because he didn't want to lose this big opportunity that he had. And also another time that Faust lost and Nixon won was when Faust lost his show, because he was spending so much time, like of his time was like invested in this whole thing with Nixon, and then he lost it, and so that's another time Nixon won and lost. All right, I can't throw that far, but yeah. That's Eric. Go Eric.
I would maybe throw it to Eric. I would have caught it.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, no worries.
I apologize. I threw it in the general.
Thank you. Yeah, like I also agree with you, because do you guys all remember that part where he Nixon gets really overconfident and he starts like drunk dialing Faust, and he starts like talking to him about hamburgers. Like I think that also like what you said is like he got too overconfident a bit, because and you can see how it affects him in like the next interview where he's like he's a little tense because he doesn't remember what he said. He drunk dialed him, so I mean pretty weird. Anyone else?
I think overall, kind of connecting to the first part of this, is that everyone kind of expected Faust to lose. They expected Faust to kind of come in and just be pummeled by Nixon, and I think Nixon kind of got blinded by his confidence and his arrogance, and I think that enabled Faust to be a little scrappy and kind of pull through at the end, whereas Nixon was more, he thought he could be in control the whole time, kind of like he thought he could be in control of the whole Watergate scandal, and it ends up that he's not as great as he makes himself out to be. Nixon's not as great, and I think that really shows throughout the play, is that Nixon pretends to be, he's got a sort of a god complex, and that just kind of breaks down in this interview.
Sorry. I think that both of them are sometimes overconfident. I think in the beginning, Faust was overconfident with his abilities to interview Nixon. I think he was like, oh, like, it'll be so easy to, it seemed that way from the beginning that Frost thought it wouldn't be too hard to get what he wanted out of Nixon. And then Nixon like proved to him that like that wasn't the case. And then I think it ended up being that Nixon was overconfident in his abilities to like kind of get like out of what Frost was trying to get him to say. Okay. I'm really sorry.
So it might be just me, but I feel like most of the time Frost was on the defensive. He was like cowering in a corner because most of the time Nixon was a master politician, as we all know. He knows how to work people and sentences to make himself seem better. And as it said throughout the story, most of the interviews Frost was slaughtered. Like it was Nixon most of the interviews, but he had one last chance, one big king, so to say, in Nixon's armor that he could exploit and he could turn the tide. Like I feel like the place that it really turned around for Frost is that night when Nixon did call Frost and gave that speech and started talking about hamburgers. I feel like that kindled something, and you can see like before he was more passive. I mean, like with a lot of the interviews before he started interrupting, but he really didn't push. And that last interview with Watergate, it was not just one-sided anymore. It was Frost that was on top for the first time. And that power that he had was too great. I mean, Nixon, even though Nixon had basically won all the rounds beforehand, Frost had landed a KO. It was over after that.
I think we also see like sort of the two different cultures where American, it's sort of like, you know, this is what I want and I'm gonna, you know, get it. We're more aggressive, whereas, you know, an interview in the UK or Australia or something is very like civilized and you're nice and polite and you follow social constructs. And then he saw how Nixon was acting and he adapted to the situation, which is kind of interesting to see that like that two social dynamics collapsing.
Alright, so this is like a side note kind of, but so the Playwright guy saw it as a prize fight, and I kind of, while reading it, it's like Frost had his little team behind him, and it's almost like trainers in boxing, and then Nixon had Brennan. It's kind of like when they would interrupt the video, they kind of like train their guys up like boxers do when they go to the corners. So it's just another little analogy as well.
I just want to make sure that when Clark said RopeADope, did you say? Does everybody know what that means? A RopeADope. It was coined. I actually used to always teach this at the VP Lang class. The fight between Muhammad Ali and this big guy named George Foreman, and Muhammad Ali let himself be punched to death, kind of like Frost was, until the big elephant could not punch anymore. So RopeADope, he would go into the corner by the ropes and be punched, and punched, and punched.
Didn't he do it like for three? What do they call it? Rounds.
Yeah, three. Yeah, and it's now entered the language of it became so famous. A RopeADope is like you purposely tire out your opponent, and then you go after him later on.
Was that in the Rumble in the Jungle?
That's a Rumble in the Jungle. Very good. Right.
Okay, so yeah, I think it's really interesting how Nixon's kind of biggest blow was that call that he made while he was drunk in scene 15. But the problem is that that big blow kind of served as a wake-up call for Frost. So it turns out that what I feel like what affected Frost the most, what really hurt him the most, was that call. The problem is that call didn't like knock him out, it just encouraged him. And as Jake said, it kind of changed his mindset about how he should carry out the interview. So I find it really interesting that kind of Nixon was his own downfall. He got too cocky, he called while he was drunk, he was talking to Frost, and that kind of awakened like this vicious side of Frost that wasn't really there before. And basically that just kind of pushes Frost. I mean, it says Frost is deeply shaken, the blood has run from his lips, and then he says, I've got to work. So this kind of like the true starting point for him. And I think this is where he just kind of really concentrates his efforts and he's able to beat Nixon.
I actually think just the opposite. I thought the drunk call wasn't really a drunk call. I thought it was the final blow that Nixon punched to Frost. I think Nixon did that in order to win, because he said that the snobs there look down on you too. He's trying to ruin his ego and call him a talk show host and all that. And he's trying to ruin Frost's ego. But I think what he did is just made him mad as hell, and it just made him really angry. And by the end of it, he was just so shaken. And after that, also receiving the news that his shows in Australia and the UK were going to be canceled, he realized that he already lost it all. And I guess it kind of goes with the prize fight too, because you know from Rocky, the scene where he goes into the final training montage and Eye of the Tiger comes on, I think that kind of went through his head. And he finally realized what he had to do and what he had been training for. And he finally just prepared the questions, and he didn't let Nixon do his usual lawyer stuff, and he just, any little bit of space that Nixon allowed himself in the fighting rink, Frost just went in for it until finally Nixon broke.
Should we move on to question 2, I guess?
Ben's been behind you.
Awesome.
I like thinking about this now, about how everybody's talking. It reminds me a little bit of a movie I watched recently. Just it never really stuck out to me before, but just as we were talking about it, it really reminds me of a great movie I watched called Whiplash. One of you?
I knew you were going to say that.
Yeah. I found it very inspiring, like loving music as I do and stuff like that. But as I think about it, the relationship between Nixon and Frost is almost the same as the teacher and the student. In Whiplash, the teacher keeps mentally abusing him throughout the movie. We can all say throughout the movie, the teacher has the upper hand on the drummer, right? If anybody's watched that movie. But it's that final straw right at the end at the concert when he gets on stage and the director pulls the rug out from under him. It's like, we're playing a song that you don't even know. You don't even have the sheet music to. And he goes off the stage. He's humiliated because he doesn't know what to do. He feels defeated. But then all of a sudden he gets the courage again to go back despite being pummeled. It's kind of like Faust with Nixon, being pummeled in all the previous rounds, being abused. And he goes back and he gives the performance of a lifetime. Maybe like Faust did in the Nixon interviews, where he pushed Nixon on the opposite hand to the brink, to the breaking point in which he couldn't hold back anymore. Where he admitted to his crimes that thousands of journalists, reporters, and politicians have tried to get him to do before. And I feel like that battle between the two, that mental battle between the two, I don't see it as, I'm more related to that movie, Whiplash, than I do a boxing ring, because it's more of a clash of minds than a clash of might.
I just want to talk about the interview, or not the interview, the phone call. And before, he didn't really realize it, but you see someone in a professional setting, you only think of them as a professional, in that light. If you say a mailman, you only see a mailman as the mailman. You don't see him as a person with husband, wife, and kids. But when he gives that call, it opens up a whole new realm of who Nixon is. He's becomes more than just someone he's interviewed. It becomes a person. And when you're dealing with a person instead of someone that has their guard up and you're interviewing, it sort of allowed him to think in a way of that he could be able to interview him more effectively. That's right.
Do you want to say a question?
Nice catch.
So moving on to the next question, because I feel like we've all said good things about that. Nixon explains when you're in office, you got to do a lot of things sometimes that are not always, in the strictest sense of the law, legal. But you do them because they're in the greater interests of the nation. This argument is essentially that the ends justifies the means. Should actions be judged based on their consequences or on the basis of moral principles? Why? I believe that there's a very gray area. I feel that there is no one specific answer because there leaves room for so many exceptions.
I think we should guide ourselves by moral principles, but to each and every person, moral principles are different. So I don't know. I think that this is a really good question.